Good evening, comrades. Thank you very much for joining us in our latest session of our series, Why Marx? We have previously discussed in the last few sessions that Marx and Engels were quite revolutionary when they managed to identify the working class as the only force that can overthrow capitalism and by doing so liberate all of humanity. No other class, according to Marx and Engels, can do that. And well, we all thought that's true, although there's always room for discussion on those things, but certainly that seems to be a viable tactic, strategy to get to socialism, communism. And while we are seeing sections of the trade unions currently fighting back and on strike, etc., clearly things have changed quite dramatically since the time that Marx and Engels were writing about capitalism and the working class. So at that time, we saw peasants, etc., being forced into the cities, being forced into big factories, etc., and huddled together in big factories, which of course helped to organize people and push them together and made them into a force, into a class. Has capitalism changed too much for the working class to still exist as such a class? Atomization is growing massively. People are working more and more from home. More and more people are being pushed into self-employment, etc. Do these people become petty bourgeois as they were at Marx and Engels' time? Are we like shopkeepers? Does that stop us organizing as a class? What about the police and the army? Are they just workers? Where are they on the spectrum? So these are lots of questions we want to look at today. We want to look at it at the past. How did Marx and Engels write about it? Then we're going to look at today, the idea of trade unionism, mentality of trade unionism, sociological concepts as anti-Marxist, etc. And then we're going to look at the international division of labor and what work could look like under socialism and capitalism. Before we start, though, we would really like to encourage all comrades to ask questions, to get involved in these sessions, especially if you do not understand anything or a concept or a phrase or anything. I mean, most of us have been around the left for a long time, and we sometimes use phrases without kind of knowing that perhaps other people who are new or not as experienced don't know about. So please, there are no daft questions. It helps everybody. There are no wrong questions. It helps everybody to learn, those in the Zoom, those watching later, but also the speakers who will have to think about things in a different way. So please, if you have a question or a comment, please get involved. So we're going to start first with Luke Pickrell, from the Marxist Unity Group in the US. He will discuss Marx's concept of a class in itself and for itself, and its role as the gravedigger of capitalism.
Thanks, Tina. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Let's see. Awesome. So, as Tina mentioned, I'm going to go ahead and start us off with a little bit of a look back into the history of some of these ideas and the workers' movement kind of more generally. And I'm asking this question of what has Marxism said about the working class, with that idea of looking back into the past. And I'm emphasizing this point of has in order, I think, to do two things. One, to kind of give us as authentic an idea of what has been said, but also perhaps to use some of the language and kind of spirit of the particular time. So I'm intentionally using some words that and some phrases that I think are helpful, but that I also think accurately represent, particularly during the period of the Second International, how these terms were being talked about. So I'll be talking about the living and the working conditions of the working class, touch on those briefly, the idea of the revolutionary potential of the working class, the difference between a class in itself and a class for itself, and I'll discuss that. and then how the working class can realize its historic mission. So I think broadly we can say that the working class is dependent on the sale of its labor power as a commodity on the market, and that it experiences its existence in three ways. First, as a state of precarity, a general state of precarity. Secondly, as a generalized lack of control. And then finally, as a consistent lack of freedom, in the sense that it lives only to acquire the means of living. Life is essentially this kind of feedback loop. And it's this question of freedom, essentially this consistent lack of freedom, that is very much all over Marx's interest in discussing the working class, who they are, what can they be. And I think we can say that the working class experiences labor consistently as a means to an end and not as enjoyment or self-actualization in itself. So again, we labor in order to simply reproduce ourselves and go back to labor. Labor does not have this quality of being a means towards self-realization or self-actualization. And I'll throw out a few quotes to kind of back this up. We have Friedrich Engels writing that the proletariat is that class in society which lives entirely from the sale of its labor power, whose weal and woe, whose life and death, whose sole existence depends on the demand for labor, hence on the changing state of business, on the vagaries of unbridled competition. So again, existence depending on the sale of labor power. What is life? It's weal and woe, and it's dependent on uncontrollable forces, forces that dominate itself, the changing state of business, the vagaries of unbridled competition. Second, we have Marx writing that the worker only feels himself outside his work, and in his work feels outside himself. He feels at home when he's not working, and when he's working, he does not feel at home. This labor is not the satisfaction of a need. It's merely a means to satisfy needs external to it. And then as soon as no physical or other compulsion exists, labor is shunned like the plague. So if that kind of presents an image of the working class that Marx was examining, and then I think we can also be thinking about if it explains what we know about work or the working class that we observe today. The question becomes what potential does it have? And this, of course, is something that makes Marx unique among the socialists of his time in saying perhaps there is a potential that this force in society has. It's not something that we should pity. It's not something that we should see angelic qualities in. It's not something that we should dismiss. The workers' movement itself is the key to realizing real transformation. So what potential does it have? And this is not innate potential, which means that the worker, is not born with potential, because of course a person is not born a worker or stamped as a worker. They are born as a human being, but then put into a certain position in society, depending on the society they live in. So this is potential that comes from the person's position in society and the class's position in society as a whole. This is a large group of people. So we have Friedrich Engels writing that the ruling big bourgeoisie has fulfilled its historic mission, that it's no longer capable of the leadership of society and has even become a hindrance to the development of production. That historical leadership has passed to the proletariat, a class which, owing to its whole position in society, can only free itself by abolishing altogether all class rule, all servitude, and all exploitation. So what I don't have here is the quote perhaps that folks are more familiar with, the idea that the working class is the grave digger of capitalist society. It's, irony of all ironies, capitalism itself produces its own grave diggers. That still is very much the case, and I think that can be taken from everything I'm saying. But I like this quote because it has this idea of the historic leadership passing to the proletariat. And this is something that is kind of central to the working class movement, this idea that there are no longer other sections of society that will be that leading force that is needed to take all of humanity to a higher position, essentially. And that historic leadership has now passed to the proletariat. So how can we kind of examine things today? I think today we can say that the class exists as the reproducer of society with sporadic expressions of resistance to capital. So that is, every day people go to work and they remake the society with a surplus, a little different each time. And there are real acts of resistance to capital. But that only in potential does the class exist as a revolutionary force with socialism at its aim. So we could say perhaps it's more reactive than creative, perhaps is one way. But kind of more famously, the way to put this question is to say it's a class in itself, meaning it has more of an object-like quality to it, versus a class for itself, which is essentially recognizing itself as that subject of transformation, as that subject of history. So we can also describe that as perhaps the class in itself being the reproducers of society, as I said, with sporadic resistance to capital, versus the class realizing itself as the conscious transformer of society with socialism as its aim. So I'm going to talk about this idea for itself now. I've kind of laid out the class more generally, and now we're heading into the territory of socialism, social democracy. How can the class become that transformative object? Or I should say subject, excuse me. So to become for itself, the class needs many things, but I'm just going to highlight a few. I'll talk about class consciousness. I'll talk about the role of an organized party that aims for political power. And then I'll touch on this idea of, excuse me, of expanding the circle of awareness, which is very much tied into these things. I'll also talk about that term because it's not a term that I think folks usually encounter. So how can we understand class consciousness? Folks will describe class consciousness in a lot of ways, and I think there are a fair number of ways of describing it. But I want to kind of hone in on this idea that class consciousness is the recognition that the class's needs can only be met through socialism, that essentially it has to push beyond reforms, beyond the confines of working within trade unions, that its needs can only be met through a kind of fundamental transformation. In that sense, then I think class consciousness also means that the class, or sections of the class, individuals even, you could say, take up the banner of social democracy, and they devote their free time, most of their free time, to the cause of what I think is well referred to as spreading the good news of socialism, which I'll also describe, and the idea of expanding the circle of awareness. And I like this idea of devoting free time because that's essentially all it means to be a professional revolutionary, as Lenin, refers to it as. That term has been presented a certain way as kind of a hardened cadre member, perhaps. But I think we can say it as class consciousness is when someone devotes a lot of their free time to the cause of talking about socialism. And then part of this is also this idea of being disabused of Republican superstitions. And this is a term that Karl Kautsky uses. And essentially, it's this idea of, in particular, countries at least with some form of so-called democratic institutions, essentially saying to folks, what you know of as freedom, what you know of as democracy is not that. What you have, you are told, is the end-all be-all, the best that you can get. And in fact, it's not. So class consciousness is kind of being disabused and helping spread disillusion of what's presented as, the best that one can get. So I'll talk a little about the Socialist Party. The Socialist Party is not the entire class. The Socialist Party agitates for democracy in all areas of society, as the quote I'll present will talk about. The Socialist Political Party, it spreads the good news of socialism and expands this circle of awareness, as I'll get to. It's the memory of the class, so to speak. It's kind of the historical carrier and collector of mostly past failures and past victories. And importantly, it aims for political power and it agitates against those who are in power. So it aims to take political power and it disabuses and pokes holes in the existing social power. And I like this quote from Lenin in regards to the party. This is in What Is to Be Done. He says, the working class consciousness cannot be genuine political consciousness unless the workers are trained to respond to all cases of tyranny, oppression, violence, and abuse, no matter what class is affected. Unless they're trained, moreover, to respond from a social democratic point of view and no other. The consciousness of the working masses cannot be genuine class consciousness unless the workers learn from concrete and above all from topical political facts and events to observe every other social class. So, I was reading recently Rosa Luxemburg's mass strike, and she's talking about what she's seeing in in Russia in 1905. And, folks are very active. The workers are very active. And her detractors in Germany mostly are saying, well, look at these kind of young, untrained, kind of loosey-goosey kind of socialists over there in Russia. One little thing happens and they react, and this is a sign of immaturity and youthfulness. And she's saying, no, not at all. This is a sign of a very high degree of class consciousness. The fact that they respond to the cases of tyranny, oppression, and violence that affect all classes. And I think Karl Kautsky puts it well in regards to the party when he says that to make this struggle of the workers conscious and unified, to keep its one great object in view, this is the purpose of the Socialist Party. And I'll end with this idea of the circle of awareness. So this is Lars Lee's creation that he kind of takes from Karl Kautsky. Karl Kautsky very much influenced by the Erfurt program. The Erfurt program very much influencing all of kind of Second International social democracy, very much influencing Lenin. It's this idea that social democracy being the party of the class-conscious sections of the working class, that it essentially spreads the good news to other sections of society. So first, it's spread to the workers' movement, perhaps those who are closest to the folks who are in social democracy, who are closer to or more agitational. And it spreads outwards from there, then moving into the proletariat, the larger laboring classes. And it expands as far as it can go. There is no point in which we say, well, we're going to not try to agitate over here, over there. The idea is really trying to spread the good news, so to speak, to as many layers of society as possible. So I'll conclude with these 2 points. I think we can say that because the working class is the object of history, that is the one that makes capitalist society function every day, it can be the subject of history. It can be the subject of history, the subject that makes the future in a way. And this would be in contrast to folks who might say, well, the working class is not both the subject and the object. Perhaps something else is the subject of history. Perhaps capital itself is the subject of history and it only acts on the working class. And then we can also say that part of bringing this transformative power to the working class is that the socialist movement must merge with the advanced sections of the working class. There has to be this unity of the fighting working class and the ideas and the good news of socialism. So thank you very much, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Luke. I think we might have to, in the discussion, revisit that graph about the inside the social democracy and, or, socialism and social democracy. That's how Lenin used it at the time. But then the workers' movement, the proletariat, and the laboring classes, because I think it's for many people that will all be the same thing, but it would be useful, I think, perhaps for the discussion to look at that in more detail. Okay, thanks very much, Luke. That was very interesting. Okay, next is Ian Spencer, please. You need to unmute yourself, comrade.
Good evening, comrades. When I was at college in the 1980s, struggling with my 1A level in sociology, one of the favourite exam questions that would crop up would go something like, discuss the idea that we're now all becoming middle class. We were then invited to discuss whether we were living through a period of the embourgeoisement of the working class, as a result of the decline, at least in the UK and USA, of industries such as mining and steel making and manufacture, and the growth in jobs such as teaching and social work and office-based occupations, which were described as middle class. The implication was clear that Karl Marx's assertion of a growing class consciousness as a result of the putative immiseration of the working class had been overtaken by events. If proof were needed, all one had to do was look at the affluent worker study by Goldthorpe and Lockwood and QED. The working class was becoming better off and de-aligned from class politics. While it's true that in some of Marx's early work, such as The Poverty of Philosophy, published in 1847 as a critique of the anarchist Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, he seems to argue that the impetus for a socialist revolution would be on the fact that workers' wages were being constantly driven down by capital. But by the time Marx had published Capital, Das Kapital, in 1867, his analysis had changed significantly. Marx was able to show that the exploitation of labour was an objective social relationship. Not only does one not have to feel exploited to be so, but it was quite possible to see rising levels of exploitation at the same time as real wages. Moreover, some of the most exploited workers may be some of the best paid from the point of view of the rate of surplus labour. I'm going to argue that not only is there still a working class, but the proletariat is now far larger than in Marx's day. Moreover, instead of Marx being one of the holy trinity of founders of sociology, along with Max Weber and Emil Durkheim, sociology comes from a philosophical perspective in opposition to Marx. More importantly, sociology became an academic discipline tied to the reformist politics of social democracy, in the sense of social democracy today rather than in Lenin's day, which is implacably opposed to the liberation of all humanity from commodity production and class society. Sociology is to reformist social policy what Keynesian economics is to the Marxist critique of political economy. The next time you're in London, you will undoubtedly want to go and visit the grave of Karl Marx in Highgate Cemetery. As you stand there in awe of his achievement of uncovering some of the laws of motion of capital accumulation and putting history and socialism on a scientific footing, you may feel the need to sit down as you contemplate the millions who have struggled for our emancipation. If so, there's a convenient slab directly across the path. It's the tomb of Herbert Spencer, who is, as far as I know, wholly unrelated to me. Spencer was an early and in his day well-known sociologist, opponent of socialism and vulgar social Darwinist, who coined the term survival of the fittest, a term which was not originally employed by Darwin. Marx had the greatest respect for Darwin, and but for the death of his old friend Wilhelm Wolff, might have dedicated Capital to him. Marx even sent Darwin a copy of Capital, although it's clear that he never read it. Marx saw in the evolution of species by natural selection, the dialectics of nature, and how struggle led to the development of humanity by shaping itself by working on nature. Spencer, by contrast, saw the survival of the fittest as the vindication of the superiority of some races and nations over others. In so doing, he set the tone of the essential conservatism of sociology. Spencer's only lasting legacy was that he invented the paperclip. But in Germany, Max Weber, born in Erfurt in 1864, was to reframe sociology as the loyal servant of reformist politics. I'm not suggesting that all sociologists are right-wing or that we need to have any fear of their or our researchers. Auguste Comte, who coined the term sociology, was a pupil of the utopian socialist Henri de Saint-Simon, Émile Durkheim was on the soft left of French politics. However, his attitude to the Paris Commune was totally different to that of Marx. Whereas Marx regarded the Commune as the first attempt by the working class to take power, Durkheim's concern was with the stability and coherence of society, and the Commune was indicative of a functional breakdown. Max Weber, though, knew exactly whose side he was on. He was a liberal and a member of the German Democratic Party, and it is said that his life's work was, quote, a dialogue with the ghost of Marx. He played a part in writing the constitution of the German Weimar Republic and was an unsuccessful Democratic Party candidate for the Reichstag. One of the many caricatures of Marx was that he asserted there were only two classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Even the briefest look at his work shows that he discussed the aristocracy, whose means of appropriation of wealth is the rent of land, the petit bourgeoisie, the class of small property owners, and the déclassé lumpen proletariat, as well as references to the better paid strata of the working class. However, the main point is that for Marx, class was an objective relationship to property. Moreover, the form by which the surplus is extracted from the working population is a defining feature of society. The ancient world, which exploited the unfree labour of slaves, or feudal society which extracted a surplus by a variety of different means from serfs, was defined in part by class relations to property. Capitalism, by contrast, extracts its surplus by the supposedly free workforce that enters into the labour contract. However, as we saw in our discussion of capital, workers have no choice but to enter that labour contract if they wish to avoid absolute poverty and starvation in much of the world and relative poverty in the most developed countries. A relative poverty that will also shorten the worker's life and limit the possibilities in every sphere of their existence. Marx's use of the term proletariat is important. In ancient Rome, the proletariat was the class of landless labourers. In some ways, their position was more precarious than some slaves. For although they were legally free, they were also free to starve if they couldn't sell their labour power. By contrast, in a short essay, Class, Status and Party, Weber suggested a largely subjective definition of class, and this has come to dominate sociology as it's taught in most universities and schools. Beyond that, we're treated regularly to the most trivial discussion of social class by the bourgeois press, in which social class is defined by a series of lifestyle choices. Even the state's official classification by the Registrar General is based around Weber's notion of status related to occupational groups. Weber, of course, also acknowledged the importance of wealth and political influence, but neither of these are regarded by Weber as any more significant than status. The reason why Weber was so influential was precisely because he was writing in Germany, which was expected by many, including Marx, of being the most likely country to initiate socialist revolution. In 1878, Otto von Bismarck, alarmed by the growth of the Social Democratic Party, instituted anti-socialist laws. Shortly after, he made significant concessions to workers by instituting social insurance and the beginnings of elementary health provision, decades before similar reforms by the liberal Lloyd George. The development of a reformist realpolitik to prevent the possibility of socialist revolution is precisely reflected in the sociological works of Max Weber. Weber and the official state version of social class is asserted as somehow more sophisticated than that of Marxism, but I would argue that it obscures the real social relations of society. Instead of understanding that even the best paid workers remain proletarians. It is important here to understand that I'm not arguing against the use of empirical data. One of the most striking things about Marx's Capital is that it is full of references to official statistics, often compiled by Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Factories and other sources. Moreover, even today, official statistics are very useful for understanding and illustrating the nature of our current society. Nor am I arguing that factors such as differing social status can exert an influence over and above poverty. For example, the Whitehall studies, a longitudinal study of the health of civil servants, which has been conducted since 1967, shows that the most important single social determinant of the mortality and morbidity of UK civil servants is their civil service rank. This appears to exert an influence over the mere differential in income, although that too is important. The same observation of class differential can be made of education and a wide range of other social indicators. The crucial difference between Marx's understanding of class and Weber's or contemporary sociology is the emphasis on reform. The path-breaking work by Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson on inequalities in health on a global scale retains at its heart the assertion that the aim is to reform income distribution rather than the radical reconstitution of society at large. Marx understood that under capitalism, poverty is a necessary condition for the existence of wealth. Without a class of proletarians of only their labour power to sell, there is no source for the profits of capital. As we saw in our discussion of the Communist Manifesto, Marx put forward concrete proposals for reforms that would improve the position of workers, but that was also bound up with a complete overthrow of the bourgeoisie and the elimination of all classes in favour of a society of freely associated workers. As we see in this quote from Volume 3 of Capital, Marx understood perfectly well that there were many gradations within the proletariat. In England, modern society is indisputably the most highly classically developed in economic structure. The stratification of those classes does not appear in its purest form. Middle and intermediate strata here obliterate and the demarcation everywhere, although incomparably less in the rural districts than in the cities. However, this is immaterial to our analysis. The quote here is a fragment which, had Marx lived to complete the work, would have been a whole chapter on social class. I would argue that the task of Marxists today is to fully understand the present, including the social structure, and learn the lessons that can form the basis of a guide for future action. Yes, there is still a proletariat. It is larger and more internationalized and interconnected than it's ever been. And moreover, the bourgeoisie is still creating more of its own gravediggers. In the period since 1945, has seen a contraction, at least in the USA and UK, of industrial sector jobs. There are not as many large factories. By contrast, I can have a real-time conversation with workers in the US or Australia. Moreover, whereas cars, for example, may have been made entirely in the UK, including the steel for the bodywork, it is now likely that a car is the product of a worldwide proletariat. We've seen this recently with the shortage of new cars owing to supply problems with microprocessors, many of which are manufactured in Taiwan. While there has been an expansion of so-called white-collar jobs, many of these have become proletarianized and de-skilled as the skill becomes embodied in computers in exactly the same way that Marx argued that the skills previously in the hands of workers became the property of the bourgeoisie by their embodiment in machinery, and we see this in Volume 1 of Capital. The petit bourgeoisie of Marx's day, the small proprietors and peasants, have been decimated. Someone self-employed today is more likely to be on a 0 hours precarious contract. Even university staff are as likely to go from one short-term contract to another. There is naturally an impact on class struggle and organisation. The government knows this. In 1982, during the health workers' dispute, when rail, post and other workers struck in support of NHS staff, the government knew that it would have to buy off the Royal College of Nursing. I know this, I've seen the cabinet minutes. The consequence was a collapse in the dispute, and many of the laws used to beat the health workers were then used against the miners. The government is doing it again, where nurses and university workers' disputes have been paused, the aim being to make it easier to break the RMT. This is at a time when many trade unions operate like specialist departments of human resources and, like the Labour Party, are marshalling workers behind the interests of capital, haggling over the price of the sale of labour power rather than for its abolition. At the same time, in the UK and worldwide, inequalities are growing wider. The concentration of wealth in fewer hands is growing to such an extent that even economists such as Thomas Piketty, whose Capital in the 21st century plays on the title of Marx's Das Kapital, despite the fact that Piketty has never read it. Piketty, like Joseph Stiglitz, is so concerned that inequalities are becoming so great as to be dysfunctional for capitalism. Like Durkheim and Weber before them, their concern is with the effect on the stability of capitalism and the need for reform in order to preserve it. It's not for nothing that both Piketty and Stiglitz have been advisors to John McDonnell. It's important to note here the emphasis on income rather than wealth, which is even more unequally distributed. Wealth is concentrated in few hands. The consequence is the destruction of the natural environment and the impoverishment of large parts of the world. The only way out of our gradual drift towards barbarism in the world is the worldwide communist revolution. After all, the proletariat has never been more powerful.
Thank you, comrade. I mean, just a quick question on that one, because it's not really about income, though, is it? Or wealth? I mean, we identify working class as you have to sell your labor power, don't we? So, I mean, Frederick Engels was very, very rich, and still we would think he was a member of the working class. He supported the working class. Do you think that is the right definition? You know, if you have to sell your labor power, that makes you
absolutely. I think that's the crucial difference. I mean, Frederick Engels didn't even have to sell his labor power. He could, if he'd wanted to, just lived off the back of the firm Ehrman and Engels. But you know, I think he understood the part he played. He wasn't even beneath pilfering the petty cash to help Marx, to support Marx in his studies. I think to a large extent, one's class is the class you align yourself with. And from that point of view, one could argue that Marx and Engels, despite not exactly being the horny-handed sons of toil, were nevertheless the most gifted protagonists of the working class, the most important section of the proletariat. But the fundamental class relation, the one that defines the nature of the society, is the way in which the surplus is extracted from the working population. We see this in Capital in Volume 3. And it's that which gives us human alienation. It's that which turns work into a nightmare for most people, and so on. Yeah. Because
it wouldn't work the other way around. I guess if you're really poor, you can't just, say, I'm now identifying as a capitalist. It wouldn't work the way around.
Well, we to a certain extent, we do see that, don't we? I've known people who were poor as a church mouse, but would still spend all night camped out on the pavement in London so that they could wave a flag at some princeling as they go past.
It doesn't make you a capitalist, though.
But it doesn't make you a capitalist. I mean, of course, this is one of the things we is crucial to understand. The changes in class structure have had an impact on class consciousness. But that doesn't mean to say that we're all irreconcilably bourgeois because we, buy a flat screen telly or don't, and drink Prosecco or something. This is the kind of trivial nonsense that is a contemporary feature of sociology. If you go to a sociology conference, you won't hear any talk of the proletariat. Most of them would be talking about some postmodernist nonsense concerning this.
I didn't want to cut off Matthew's contribution. I thought the wealth and income, I thought it was slightly potentially misleading, leading us in the wrong direction, because it's not really about how much you earn, but the relationship to the means of production, isn't it? Matthew.
Yeah, I think that what you were just saying, I think is important. What I was going to try and deal with is the situation at the moment in terms of the development and movement of the working class, and why it is we sit at the moment, where obviously there's been essentially a quiescence of the class struggle over 30 years, and what's happening, what the impact is now. I think that, and what you said, the thing about definition of class, though, is it's twofold, isn't it? I mean, what you've been talking about is the relationship to production, but it's also about consciousness, and it's dialectical, it's dynamic, and therefore class. It's if you look at it in that sense, class obviously will fluctuate and vary, according to the state of understanding and organisation of the working class itself, and how much of the working class actually understands its own position and its place in history. And therefore, it's not a fixed thing in that sense. It's, as I say, it's a dynamic thing, and we can see it obviously, movement in that sense, throughout history in terms of the working class's own understanding of what its historic mission is, and how much it can actually take on the capitalists. I mean, the thing is, as is put by Marx, incredible piece in the 1840s, which is, well, the class itself is capable of realizing itself as a class as against the capitalists. But the point is that it must go beyond that. It has to go beyond, to say, well, its actual historic mission is to actually overthrow the capitalists. And in that sense, it's not actually fully a class. The working class itself doesn't realize itself as a class in full sense until it takes power. Once it takes power, actually then it abolishes, all classes, including itself. So it's quite extraordinary in that sense. Well, the thing is, in terms of what's been happening now, of course, is a move. The other point I think I was going to say in terms of what Ian said, of course, is the famous sociological study of the Luton car works in the 60s, in which they said, well, all these guys are all becoming middle class, all this sort of stuff. And then a few months later, the whole place walked out on strike. Complete political change, and suddenly, there was back to class conflict. So in those terms, what the key point in what's happened over the last period, of course, is the move of the capitalists themselves away from industrial capital and the sort of structure of the Cold War consensus, in which bureaucratic control of the working class, to finance capital, which actually originates in the early 70s, the impact of the Vietnam War and so on, and of course the rising working class of the 60s. Early 70s, and there's a deliberate move towards finance capital. And the point about finance capital, of course, is it can then in that sense divorce itself from immediate questions of production and being tied into production and become mobile and thus actually instead of being tied to given plants and so on and so forth over decades and whatever else, it can move itself around and use that against the working class, which is what it's done. Essentially, if we look at the whole process, of course, is it strips out, as we've seen, heavy industry, particularly obviously heavy industry and so on and so forth, out of particularly obviously Britain and the US, but also in other countries. But that also ties in with other things in terms of capital, which is a decline of capitalism itself and the decline of the law of value, and the fact that obviously the restructuring of the working class out of work, both in terms of the realization of things which actually sort of presage the requirements of a new system, which is the requirements of work for use value, such as public services. So you've got a substantial section of the working class actually works, we work within public services, and that starts to to prefigure the new system, and also of course the institution of what we have in monopoly and oligopoly capital, which have been, if you look at any given major section of production now, of course, it's actually dominated by a handful of companies at most. In some cases, only one or two, and in some cases, actually, you've got a single factory which will dominate and actually produce all required of some given commodity. And you have situations where there's a breakdown in this, and this causes a world issue. I mean, most extraordinarily, of course, you can look at things like there was an earthquake in Japan, and the most rural part of Japan, actually northern Japan, Hokkaido, and this shut down the auto factories in the US because the components factories are running in that area, and they required a supply of these components. So you can see the whole thing just articulates itself up together. It's also, of course, the other thing, of course, is the fact is the issue of control. And part of the whole position of capital relocating itself and using that as a means of an attempt to drive down the working class, of course, is about control. And if you look at what has been happening in terms of the unions and so on, in particularly Western Europe, it was about control of the workplace. And the capitalists, in many cases, had actually in large part lost control of the workplace. And that was even on the manual side. It's even more difficult, actually, if you work in terms of a mental labor situation, because if you, even if you work for a major company, actually what it requires is is a cooperation between workers in order to make the thing function. And this isn't, necessarily, isn't really under the direct control of management. The situation with management now in major workplaces is very interesting in those terms, because is that the thing, they actually require the cooperation to a huge degree of the workforce to make the thing function. So what's happened, if you look at the example of manufacturing, of course, which is the classic one, obviously we now have the biggest manufacturing workforce in the world history, but most of it has moved to places like India and China. So you have now, the Chinese manufacturing workforce is 129 million people. The Indian workforce is 57 million people, compared to Britain, which is now down to below 3 million people working in manufacturing, or the US or whatever else. And actually it means that China has taken over as the world's largest manufacturer by 2010, which is why the Americans are so damn paranoid and are so keenly preparing for war against China, because exactly of that situation. They're afraid, because that's what has been done. So actually, but that of course itself is a facet of the crisis of capitalism itself. Its response to the working class was to say, okay, well, we'll move all these things elsewhere. But of course, then it burst out again, as we can see. Somebody said, can we have a simple definition of working class in today's society? Obviously you can say it is. You can look at it and say, right, well, it is all those people who are dependent on a wage for their living. That's probably the simplest way of identifying it. But there are other things. There are other factors, as we know. I mean, there's in terms of sort of consciousness, in terms of the different sectors and so on, and the decline, as I say, the decline of the system. But if you want a simple definition, that's it. Okay. I think the other thing, of course, that's important in those terms is the use of the state. And another thing that obviously Marx himself and other theoreticians have actually said and pointed to is the increasing role of the state in order to both control the system and try and stop it from, prevent crises from breaking out every few years. So you get increasing intervention by the state, and we've seen that. You can see that say in the bailouts of 07, 08, which basically they tried to hold the system together, sticking plaster against the system, because it would otherwise have collapsed in large part. And that process goes back over decades, and you could track it. And of course, also against the working class itself, and we see that, you can see that anywhere. And the interesting thing is, I've just spent 6 months on picket lines. I've spent 2 days on teachers' picket lines this week, because they've been on strike in Nicola Sturgeon's constituency, which is a few hundred yards up the road here. And we've not seen any cops at all, which has been extraordinary. I've not seen a single cop on a picket line in this current wave of strikes. But in those terms, it's also the repressive weight of the state against the working class, which has been critical. And we'll see it. Obviously, we'll see it more and more. But okay. So I shall leave it there, and look forward to questions.
Thank you very much. I think there's a couple of questions coming from the chat, and I think before we open up to the floor, I think I'm going to put them to you, which is the difference on the one hand between working class and proletariat. My understanding was always that, there was always been for a long time, there have been working classes, people who have to work, that precedes capitalism, but that proletariat has been used by Marx and Engels to identify wage workers under capitalism? That's one question. The other question is the question of self-employed people, petty bourgeoisie, etc. I mean, there's a bit of a difference, isn't there? Because you have like little shop owners, owning a garage, etc. You are caught between two classes, and you are your own little capitalist. So you can be won over to either side more often than not. You're won over to the capitalist side, but in periods of revolution, etc., that also opens up being won over to the working class. I think there's a difference with self-employed people. There's a huge forced self-employment. Amazon drivers. I'm self-employed. I work for one capitalist company. It just means they don't have to pay me pension or maternity leave and that kind of sick leave, etc. I'm still working class, etc. But some people said in the chat the edges are a bit fuzzy in some areas, and that is probably true. Can you just sort of to clarify it for the audience, all of you, one of you, whoever feels like they want to say something on that, the difference between working class proletariat on the one hand, but also then working class, middle class, capitalist class. Who wants to go?
Well,
Let's do Luke first, because he was first to speak. Go on, Luke.
Sure. Well, maybe I'll answer this just by returning to the circle of awareness, because I know that came up briefly. So I think if we're going to look at this through Karl Kautsky's lens, perhaps the lens of social democracy largely, the primary concern is, when answering this question, is just how amenable is the person going to be to the idea of social democracy? That's kind of the only important question. So just kind of thinking about some of the language that he uses, because it's kind of interesting. So social democracy, if you remember, is the innermost part of that circle.
Can you show it on screen again, Luke? Can you show it on screen again?
Yeah, no problem.
And of course, we should say when we talk about social democracy that Lenin and Kautsky, they meant, socialism, communism. Then that was at the time that it wasn't today's social democracy.
Let's see. So I've got it up here. So social democracy, a social democrat would be a person in one of the social democratic parties. Kautsky, interesting enough, refers to that as the fighting church of social democracy. He says social democracy, the social democrats, and I'm quoting him here, they're nothing other than the section of the fighting proletariat that's aware of its goal. So he kind of lays it out there. There's the fighting proletariat, which is the worker movement, this closest circle here. The folks who are in active resistance, I don't need to give examples. We're all aware of what a fighting proletariat movement looks like. But then the social democrats are then the one that are aware of its goal, aware of the goal of democracy, or excuse me, the role of the goal of socialism. And then pulling out a little bit, actually, I'll linger there just a little bit. He says the worker movement, that the spirit of resistance makes this section the most receptive to socialism. So that's why it's worth kind of pulling out this certain layer. You want to have an idea of what section is going to be the most receptive to socialism. He says they are animated by the spirit of organized resistance, but they don't yet have that consciousness or awareness of the final goal. The proletariat then would be somewhere in the middle of this outermost circle, the laboring classes. He refers to the laboring classes in a few different ways. One, he calls the laboring classes arrogant, egoistic, worker aristocrats. He also refers to them as the rabble, who are vegetating in hopelessness and powerlessness. So I don't know if we can include like what would traditionally go on as like the lumpen proletariat in that. But we could perhaps, say folks who maybe own a large amount of the means of production, or, are rather well off. And then of course on the outside, we'd have forces like the army, all other sections of society. So I'll end my brief speech just to say, I think my point is that the reason why it's good to answer that question, stop my share here. The reason it's good to answer that question or to think about that question is just, who are you going to spread your message to? You're trying to do it to everyone, but what sections of society are going to be the most receptive?
Thanks, comrade. Yeah, Ian had his hand up, and then Matthew again.
The only things I want to say is, first of all, the crucial thing is the sale of one's labour power. I've got nothing else to sell apart from my labour power, and that's true of the overwhelming majority of the population, and that's even true of police officers or soldiers or whatever else. Of course, they might have quite a different consciousness for all sorts of other reasons, but nevertheless, and for that reason, if for no other reason, it changes. So let's take police officers, for example, the overwhelming majority of whom come from working class backgrounds. Prior to World War I, police officers' pay was linked to unskilled manual labour. After the police strikes in London and Liverpool in 1918 and 1919, the government took the decision to consciously link police officers' pay to skilled manual labour. And that was not least in part because there was at the time the growth of a police and prison officers union, and it was felt important to make that concession. Fast forward to the 1982 health workers dispute, nurses' pay has never been as high as skilled manual workers, and this is an interesting relationship between gender and class in a sense. There has always been a kind of tacit a tacit assertion that somehow a woman's pay is the second income, and 90% of nurses are female. So, but nurses' pay was always paid less than skilled manual workers, the majority of whom are male, but more than most of the places where women are employed. So retail, hospitality and that kind of thing. But what was important in 1982 was that the nurses were bought off, with disastrous effects on all other workers. All the legislation that was subsequently used to break the miners' strike was tried out in 82 first. It was the dress rehearsal for breaking the miners. And what I find interesting about that is, an idea that somehow, you saw discussion, are nurses middle class because they're employed against state revenues rather than capital. Well, no, most of them are not even being paid, as I say, at the level of skilled manual labour. But what we're now seeing, of course, is that itself is changing. I think the fundamental thing is the sale of labour power, and even with the police and the army. I mean, if you look at soldiers, the only people who join the army, generally, unless you're going in as officers, people who are absolutely desperate, really, and the pay isn't particularly good.
Okay, Matthew, briefly, before we open up.
Yeah, in those terms, I think there is a reason why we're not seeing cops on the picket lines, because at the moment, the cops would probably sympathise with the folk on strike because they have the same issue. The point, I think, about Thatcher, of course, is one of the first things she did was to greatly increase police pay, and to actually, get them all to get trained up and so on and so forth to attack the workers, and particularly obviously the miners. So there were actually sort of big training sessions in which they all took part, and so on. And the whole thing was that, in contrast, actually, what happened after 2010, of course, was they attacked the cops, both in terms of pay and employment. So actually, what you've now got is extreme discontent among the cops, on pay and the fact that there are so few of them now compared to previously. So yeah, in those terms, but I think in terms of it, what's been said, in terms of the definition of working class and proletariat, I mean they are fairly much interchangeable. Although, of course, it's a difference because obviously, now, of course, working people who work have assets, and there's a obviously difference in consciousness. At the same time, obviously, you say, well, people are, technically self-employed. I mean, which, as you say, as Tina almost points out, is effectively a legal fiction. Effectively, they are employed. They just, it's a legal fiction in order to prevent, actually to cut down on the cost to the capitalist. Even if you own, a small variety, part of your a small productive asset like a van or a computer or whatever else, the pressure. No, I mean, capital, the pressure of finance capital and big capital is such that essentially you're crushed down anyway. Essentially you're put in that position. And that's been the case for a long time. I mean, it's actually, if you look at, the programs of all the revolutionary parties have included, precisely elements towards, petty proprietors and shopkeepers and all this sort of stuff. Well, these guys will come over in large part to the working class if we can provide have an open program in their favour. I mean, even say more so now, because I think so the weight of capital is such that, I mean, these guys are effectively reduced to the same position as workers, or if not worse in many cases. Because obviously they're not they don't have the advantage of having a contract of employment.
Thank you, comrades. So Brian in the chat makes a really good point as well, is saying that when Marx and Engels were writing, the working class was tiny, as it was in Russia when the Russian Revolution took place. Things have changed, things have changed for the worse, we were atomized, etc. But the mass and numbers of the working class have gone up dramatically, and we are in a much better position objectively to make revolution. There have been even bourgeois studies according to which across the globe, the working class is now clearly the majority, those who are employed and who have to sell their labor power to one degree or another. I think comrades in the chat are getting a bit, their knickers in a twist, 5 employees, that makes you a capitalist, or less than 5, more than 5. It's a political question as well, and a class consciousness question, as we've discussed. So there are hard and fast definitions, but in general it is, you sell your labor power and you have no access to, the means of production, that makes you a working class. Now let's open up for comments from the floor. I'm going to bring in Gary first. Hi.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes,
yeah.
Very well.
Great. Thank you. Really interesting. So I have to say, I was such a thrill to hear Ian explaining some of the theoretical history of the sociological definitions of class alongside Marx's definition of class, because I feel like I spent my whole life trying to dispel and enlighten people about what class actually means. And what proletariat or working class actually means. And I think it's really important that as Marxists, we understand that it's very, very simple, right? That it is simply a case that anybody who has no choice but to sell their labor is either proletariat or working class. The two are interchangeable as far as I'm concerned. And I have to say, Luke, I don't think there's any basis whatsoever in Marx's thinking, nor in mine, for treating that circle of awareness as being a stratification or differentiation of different class groupings. I don't think it's that at all. It might be a useful way to think about how we influence class consciousness, but that's quite different. The thing for me is that there are many, many different flavors and textures of working class consciousness and working class culture that are strongly related to the particular structural conditions of the labor that those workers are engaged in. So, for instance, there's likely to be much more working in person in a single workplace where there are thousands of other workers is quite good for developing class consciousness. Being a home worker working in isolation is not so good. The thing is, there's a constant battle going on for the consciousness of the working class. We fight for it, but the bourgeoisie fight for it as well. And they use so many different ways to fight for their consciousness. They use the royalty, as we heard earlier. They use imperialism and they use bribes that come from imperialism for the working class in Britain. I mean, that is a classic role that has been played in bribing and winning over working class people's consciousness in Britain for imperialism and capitalism. They offer higher wages to workers who generate more profit in order to convince them that they're not really working class anymore. And when I first started working in IT back in the when was it? The late 80s, early 90s, everybody I encountered in IT would say, oh, we don't need to join a trade union. We're not working class. Why would we need to join a trade union? They don't talk like that anymore, I have to say. Okay. Just as barristers don't talk like that. Well, not all barristers maybe, but I mean, I know Nick's on the call, and Nick certainly wouldn't describe being a barrister as being something other than working class. Don't forget, when we talk about the self-employed, the dockers used to be self-employed in the sense that they used to have to turn up at the gate in the hope that they'd be picked for a job every day, right? That is the equivalent of what so many 0 hours contractors are facing right now. And we call them self-employed. They're not self-employed in the sense of the petty bourgeoisie who own their own means to production. Not at all. They're actually worse off than the proletariat, worse off than people who have, contracted hours in jobs. So I think the key thing here is to understand that what the proletariat is, what the working class is incredibly simple, right? No confusion whatsoever. There are all kinds of textures of consciousness around that, how people see themselves, in which we're engaged in a battle with the bourgeoisie to win them over. And that is our primary function, in a sense, is to develop that consciousness. And I still want to be able to use the term middle class as abuse, right? Which is one of the arguments I've always had. And people turn around to me and say, well, aren't you middle class? Whatever that means. Well, one thing I would say is, no, my dad was a squaddy, right? So there's no way that anybody becomes a squaddy in the army if they're not working class. Same for a policeman, to be honest, right? So there's no question that soldiers and policemen are working class. But I'd also say it's about my consciousness, and my consciousness has come from all kinds of different things, and that makes me clearly identify as working class and as in solidarity with the international class. So I think that's how we have to understand these issues.
Yep, very well clarified. Thank you, Gary. Okay, Paul, please.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi there. Yeah, I thought it was interesting about the class distinction between working class and middle class. I agree. When it comes down to it, unless you own a company and that owns a factory or whatever, you're working class. For a starting point, for those that aren't necessarily politically engaged, so I'm not really talking about people here, really. I'm basically just talking about people that come home from work and watch the news and that sort of thing, is that, if you're not politically active, then the channel I would recommend, a chap called Gary Stevenson, who used to be an ex-city trader, and he's now an equality campaigner. And he's got a YouTube channel, a Twitter channel called Gary's Economics. And the reason I bring this up is because he distinguishes between income, i.e. what you get in a wage or salary, and wealth. Wealth, in his terms, means what what you own. So you might own your house, you own the business, etc., etc., etc. And the trouble I have with the mainstream news when they talk about economics today is that they talk about income and wealth as if they're two interchangeable terms. And I think that's wrong, but it's also deliberate because they're designed to obviously pit people up against each other, or I think that's why they do it. I was particularly interested in Ian's piece because I'm an ex-Rutland College student and social science was what I did. Sociology for me, we did learn a lot about Marx. Matt Weber, I'm familiar with. I hated postmodernism. Postmodernism is just writing several paragraphs and it goes straight over your head, and it allows people to think that they're intelligent because they've read a load of stuff they don't understand. That's how I see postmodernism. But there was one sociologist that I did really like reading, who did come from a Marxist perspective, and that was a guy called C. Wright Mills. He wrote Psychological Imagination, and he wrote his first book was called White Collar Worker. Now, the important thing about that, well, there were two things. One, he was a Marxist, but he was also American. So that's so, and of course, so I found that an interesting perspective, because obviously a lot of people in America, they used to fear talking about Marxism, but even he said in his White Collar Worker, the main difference in those days when he wrote White Collar was that the working class was generally waged, as they call it. You got paid a weekly package or whatever. Whereas the more middle class, they got paid by salary. That was the key difference. But he said ultimately, the important thing to remember was that, yes, they might earn more and they might do more high-skilled jobs, but ultimately, they were still working under somebody. So they were just, in that sense, they were still working class. And I also agree with Ian to a point where he said that the working class, to some extent, is what you identify with. I agree with Tina. It works in one way, but not the other way. If you came from money, like Tony Benn, then it certainly worked that way round. But yes, a lot of people from working class would identify capitalists, even though they're not capitalists, because they don't own a company or whatever. I stop there, thanks.
Thank you very much, comrade. Okay, Malcolm Millais, if you want to come in, you need to allow me to make you into a panelist. You've got your hand up, but I can't make you into a panelist. Okay, Steve Freeman next.
Yeah, thank you, comrades. Very interesting presentations, but I think there's one thing we're missing from the analysis, and that is, and I would argue that in the 20th century, and there is a class, the managerial class. Now, if you take the most advanced form of capital, like multinational corporation, like McDonald's or Ford's or Google, and you studied the structure of power within that corporation, you would see that at the top, there are the people who own and control those corporations. But there's quite a number of people who are employees, who are on salaries, who are in a special position because they're in an intermediate position between the bosses at the top and the mass of wage workers who are carrying out the productive activities of that business. And they're a very important strata because, and they are in a way, if you think about it, they are dependent, this strata. We could be talking 2 or 3 million, 5 million people in this country. On one hand, they depend upon the boss succeeding power. So the boss gives them the power to order people around. And on the other hand, they depend on the workers below them sort of carrying out or cooperating with them to carry out and make the business work. So they're very much an intermediate strata. And of course, they are all subdivided because top level managers, like senior managers at one end, is different from a supervisor who is very close to the, productive workers. I mean, it's like having the difference between a slave owner and a slave driver and a slave. The slave owner is one thing. The driver is whipping everybody along, as opposed to the slaves who are rowing the boat along as they go. They're different. And the slave driver is quite happy that he's not a slave. You know what I mean? Because as long as you keep whipping him into line, that'll be okay. And this is a very important strata. And I'd put them in the middle, and I'd put them a kind of form of modern petty bourgeois at the end of the day. Because socialism, we won't need that strata, by the way. They're doomed ultimately. So I think we need to have them in the analysis as well, and they haven't really been mentioned. And Ian answered this point, so I'll take a slightly different point. I wanted to ask, and Ian answered it, but anyway, are those working for the state, wage slaves, paid wages, are they part of the working class? And Ian said yes, and I agree with him. Selling labour power to the state acting as an employer, whether you're a nurse or a teacher or a prison officer, police, civil servants, rail workers, if they're working for the LNER, which is state-owned, whatever. The question is not whether you're working for a private capitalist or a state enterprise or a state capitalist. It's whether there's a production of surplus or not. And I would argue that teachers, and I would spread this out, add value to labour power. They're producing the next generation of workers. And they're adding more to that labour power than the cost of their own salaries that they're paying. So in a sense, they are creating a surplus, even though it's kind of hidden. It's not in the schools don't have profit accounts, I don't imagine. I don't think they do. Maybe they do these days. But I do think there's a difference, however, between a productive and an unproductive worker. So I would count a policeman or policewoman, police person, whatever, as being their labour being unproductive. They don't add any value to anything, but they are still wage workers. Okay, but they are just being used by the capitalists to keep everybody else in line, as opposed to actually producing more value for capital. So I think they're in a distinct position, but I don't count teachers and nurses as unproductive. I believe that they are producing to the total social capital of the business. And just to add to a point that Gary made, I do think we can make a difference between dockers being casually employed. Workers who are casually employed are still workers. Self-employed are different, because self-employed have their own tools and equipment. They are, as Tina mentioned, if you've got your own tools and equipment, then you're selling your services as a small business. I know that many people are forced to be self-employed, not out of choice, but casual employment, like the dockers were, I think they're still part of the proletariat proper. They're just their terms and conditions are so bad they can't have a job from one day to the next. They have to queue up to get a job, just like many workers are today. And a final point, then, Tina. Have we got time for a final point?
Very small one.
Okay, a small one. Republican superstitions, Luke. I agree with that. It's an idea that, and I think it's true in the 19th century, the idea that republicanism as a form of liberal democracy, many people believed that through bourgeois liberal democracy, you could introduce socialism. And in the 19th century, in this country, when you had Chartist demonstrations, people went on the Chartist demonstrations, you might be surprised to hear, with the Stars and Stripes banner flag, along with the French tricolour, because they believed at that time that America, the American Republic, gave more freedom, and therefore people looked on it not as we do today, as as imperialist flag, but they looked on it as a sort of progressive, democratic kind of Republican sort of thing that they had illusions in. So yeah, finish there.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Comrade Malcolm, you still got your hand up, but I can't make you into a panelist. I'm going to allow you to talk if you want to ask a question. You can speak now, Malcolm, if you want to.
Well, I don't know what's happened, because I'm trying to lower my hand because I don't actually have anything to say.
All right, fair enough.
And so I kept saying, I don't want to be.
I
mean, I thought everything was very interesting, and I think the definition. I mean, we've had this conversation, you and I, where you've been present, and I had this conversation with Steve, I think, about who was the working class. And I think the point is that many more people are working class, but certainly in England, than choose to think of themselves as working class, which is why and that's a big mistake. And the other big mistake is they think they live in a liberal democracy, when of course they don't. They live in an oligarchy or in a sort of religious state with a sort of undemocratic ruler. So the sort of nonsensical ideas are widespread. But I mean, I can't link those to quotes from Marx or Engels or anybody else, really. So I'm sorry, I don't know what's happened. I've got lower hand and upper hand, and I've got the upper hand, and now I'm the lower hand, so I must be working class. But if I click this, I'll become capitalist.
No, that's not going to happen. Don't worry.
Where's the capitalist? I can't find it. Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks, Malcolm. Well, I think don't we live in a liberal democracy? We live in a formal democracy, but going to the polls every 5 years is not worth the name democracy in any kind of sense how we as socialists understand it. We don't live in a dictatorship. We're not being put against a wall and shot without trial, at least, but it's not a democracy in the sense that we understand it. Actually, Brian has been waiting. I think you're Brian Green. Oh no, he's gone now. That's a shame. John, then, please.
Yeah, thanks, Tina, and thanks to the speakers. I'll try and be as brief as I can. It's been a very interesting discussion, and I can't help saying it's quite confused, because the whole nature of the debate is confused, and sometimes, as Ian has explained, deliberately confused, in my opinion. The confusions that emerge from sociology about distinctions between blue-collar workers, white-collar workers, whether you're A, B, C, D, E, etc., has done nothing for creating a unified working class. And excuse me, that's one of the points I want to make, because you can basically classify modern society in any way you want to classify it. It can be divided up whatever way you want, whatever you choose, usually with a particular purpose in mind, is the way academics approach it, whether it's to increase productivity, encourage workers into particular sections of the productive process or not. And I think that's the distinction with Marx, because Marx is coming for trying to define a working class with the point of how can we change society? How can you create a force that is capable of changing society? And we've discussed this previously. I agree with the notions that of course, the working class in Marx's terms is that based on the productive process, commodified labor, wage labor sold as a commodity. That's pretty much emerges from all his writings. In the Communist Manifesto, he's talking about how the purpose of socialists, of communists, is to create that class. It exists in itself, but it can't exist fully until it has a purpose, until it is organized, until it overcomes the divisions that are constantly being created within it. And you can see that emerging. Even from in the terms of this debate, people trying to work out how people can be excluded from the working class or included in the working class. Whereas really, from Marx's point of view, and certainly in the Communist Manifesto, he's trying to overcome those divisions between manual labor and non-manual labor, intellectual labor, non-manual labor, differences between North and South, everywhere, between nation states as well, between workers of different nationalities as well. Perhaps not emphasized enough in Marx's writings, races. But it can be said that Marx, the analysis of class, is not something fixed, and it can not only emerge as a class, it has to be worked on to develop as a class. Class consciousness is not something that is given, it has to be developed. And part of that process is trying to overcome those divisions in the working class and trying to develop that class consciousness. I think that's all the only point I want to make, but I think it's important to bear that in mind, that we can get trapped in a notion of who's in the working class, who's out of the working class, what particular role they play. That can be clear even with managerial workers, but the point of Marx is trying to make is trying to get a force that is capable of changing society. So I think it's important to bear that in mind.
And we need to win them all over, don't we? We should try and win over the petty bourgeoisie. We should try and win over police, the army, etc. We kind of need them on our side, especially those. Brian was quickly briefly kicked out of the meeting, but is back now. But I think your camera doesn't work. You can speak now, I think.
Yeah, hi, Tina. The reason I said 5 was that's the number of workers before a working capitalist lives off unpaid labor rather than their own labor. But anyway, that's besides the point. Look, we don't have to convince workers they're workers. The cost of living crisis around the world has done that for us. You know, when you have 70% of workers in most countries now living from paycheck to paycheck, they don't have to be told that they are powerless, helpless, they depend on their employers and so on and so forth. The real question is the struggle between reform and revolution. In other words, our struggle isn't to convince workers they are workers. They know they are workers. It's the solutions to their predicament, because to be quite honest, the vast majority of workers in the world today, including China, can no longer live in this way because life has become so hard. So they will obviously be attracted to begin with to the siren call of reform. Why? Because it's the least effort to gain them a better standard of living or a better life within capitalism. Revolution really is a big deal. You know, when you speak to workers and you talk to workers about the need for revolution, they understand that with revolution, it's everything on the line. And you can't see me laughing, but I have to tell you, I got thrown off a picket line the other day because I was discussing revolution to a fairly aristocratic group of workers. Can anybody guess who's on strike now who earn a fairly good income in capitalism? Train drivers, right? So these train drivers aren't interested in revolution because they have a fairly comfortable life in capitalism, but they are interested in reform. They are interested in a Labour government that will meet their needs as a better paid section of the working class. So that raises the question, who do we orientate to begin with? Who are going to be the vanguard? That is really the question we need to address. Who are the most militant workers? Who are the most organized workers? Who have the work? Which sections of the working class are most under attack? And today that's pretty clear. It's public sector workers. You know, when you look at the difference between the pay rates for public sector workers and private sector workers, we're talking about the biggest divide since records began. The average pay rise for a public sector worker today is 3%. The average pay rise for a private sector worker is 7%. Tina's winding me up, so I'll stop winding up the working class. But let me tell you, comrades, we don't have to tell workers that they're workers. We have to fight for our program, and we have to fight for revolution.
Thank you, Brian. Nicholas, please.
Yeah, thank you, everyone, for putting this on and being amazing panelists and endearing our long-winded polemics instead of questions. But yeah, I think I would like to ask a question to the panel, particularly like involving Kautsky's circle of awareness as like an organizing tool instead of like this thing that we're trying to identify as like this flat, you know, vector or whatever. It's like we're trying to bring those circles of awareness closer to each other, right? Like that's what it seems to me why Kautsky put that forward, like organizing for social democracy. So when we are talking also about definitions, which a lot of people seem confused about, a lot of people seem to have different definitions of what this means and what that means. And then some people think that it's, you know, not important to have kind of a coherent understanding of what all these definitions mean. Like how important is it when we're trying to communicate to the working class who they are, and you know, there's certain people who are and aren't. How important is it to communicate these definitions when we're trying to organize them towards socialism? and like what does that look like?
Matthew, do you want to answer straight away?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm not overly keen on Kautsky's definitions, to be honest. I mean, the thing is, I mean, in my experience, and I think a lot of other people, of course, is that you'll see, you know, people's consciousness will develop in different rates according to what happens and what they're involved in. You know, and if people are involved in struggle or whatever else, then you know, you can see there's a you know, political developments. They happen rather rapidly in many cases, and then of course, obviously, it also depends on the nature of the organisations which are around and how good they are in terms of putting out an understanding of what's going on. You know, so I mean, it's much more fluid than that, you know, in my experience. And you see, I mean, this sort of, I think the thing is, I mean, really, the one I really liked actually was a piece in Marx, Poverty and Philosophy, in which he talks that the working class can actually, you know, form itself as a class against the capitalists. The point is to, you know, i.e. a trade union sort of consciousness, which is something that also exists in Lenin. It's in what is to be done, you know, when he's attacking the economists, you know, and saying, okay, well, you know, you have to then, how does it go beyond that? And say, right, okay, actually, no, we don't just want to extract something from the system. We want rid of the damn thing altogether, and we have an alternative. You know, and you can go through how that you know, in terms of a more of a fluid thing, and in terms of, you know, the dynamic of that, and how actually, you know, at the moment, I mean, if you look in you know, in places like Britain, you know, you've got the left as exists is generally, you know, of an age, because exactly the level of the class struggle has been quite low until recently, and we're now looking to say, okay, you know, this is the great thing. I was on Peter Lines this morning with a bunch of, you know, women in their 20s who are teachers, you know, and you're saying, well, okay, you know, you guys are the new generation, you know, and you're moving into struggle and so on and so forth. So I think it's a much more dynamic thing than that. I think the other thing that we have to take into account with the working class, of course, is the efforts of the capitalists to split the working class, because the capitalists understand very well what position they're in, and that they are actually at the moment, following the Russian Revolution, on notice. You know, they are on notice, and they understand they can be got rid of. So I mean, capitalism is racist. It deliberately and consciously seeks to split the working class in that way. Capitalism is sexist for the same reason. Capitalism seeks also to split the working class by nationality, by all these other things that it attempts to use. And the same can be said in terms of people who are managerial. Now, I mean, you know, managers really constitute a whole slew of people. I mean, some people are actually, you know, by the fact that they're paid more and so on and so forth, you know, actually quite, you know, adjacent to the ruling class and the capitalists, and other people, of course, are merely, you know, running a section of folk, maybe managing a few people, you know, and get a few more quid, you know, and those, you know, there's a lot of difference in those terms, and it's, you know, the experience of people in those terms is very different, and the politics you get, you know, and then again a question of consciousness as well. So I think it's all those things. There's also been a question in the chat about the peasantry, but we should deal that separately. Thanks.
Yeah, we have one more question from the floor actually, and Ian, before I bring you in, I suggest I bring in Rob, and anybody else who's got a question, please put your hand up or a comment, and I can try and bring you in. It's also interesting in terms of the divide and rule. Listen to today's papers that Rishi Sunak has apparently give the all clear for higher pay wage rises for nurses, but not for teachers. And, you know, UCU is being picked off as well, etc. So there's this tactic has been going on for a while, obviously. Rob, hi.
Hi. Yeah, just thanks to all the speakers again. I think they were very informative talks, and I think there's, you know, definitely a lot we can take from all of it when defining the working class and looking at the kind of history of the working class and all of that. I was a lot of what I was going to say has been said. I mean, Matthew said a lot of it there, and it's this notion of what's changing the working class is, is the kind of divisions within the working class. I think, Matthew really alluded to, the kind of notion of identity politics included into that, that it pits one section of the working class against another. And I was going to kind of bring that up. But yeah, you got to it. So well done. We also got the, I think also a key development in the working class is the way that working class is being progressively de-skilled through the existence of capitalism, and that we are, that there is, and that in itself is a barrier to class consciousness, because we are become much more dependent on the wages system than there was even in Marx's time. The general ability of people to be able to go out and and survive on the land around them is much more limited now than it was then, and the general knowledge of people in that regard as well has been impacted. I had some kind of thoughts about the kind of notion of how do you define the working class, and I think again it's been echoed in many comments and things. It's do you depend on a wage for your survival? I think it comes down to that as a kind of as the essential kind of core of it. Do you feel the pressure to work to ensure your own subsistence? I think that's at the heart of it. I would disagree with what Brian said about you don't need to tell workers they're workers, because I think that's the problem, especially in Western nations, is the aspirations of workers to become capitalists. That we have this notion that if you work hard and you persist and you try and you can climb the ladder, you can become a capitalist yourself. And I think a lot of people are caught in that trap of thinking that's just, if I live like that, I will become a capitalist. And it doesn't work like that, unless you have property, unless you have that relation with property, you can't climb out of the class. Yeah, I also need to kind of read Kautsky now. I feel I've not really encountered him much in my reading circles. So I think, it's a good representation tonight on that. So thanks, comrades.
Last T. Lee does a good evaluation of Kautsky's cycle of awareness and stuff. It's a very good book, actually. I mean, this idea, that the working class is identified in terms of its relationship to the means of production and having to sell your labor power does reflect Marx's, one of those famous saying, isn't it? We've got nothing to lose but our chains. So if you don't own massive means of production, you have a real interest into overthrowing capitalism, because you literally own nothing. That doesn't mean you don't, you can own your house. Of course, you own a car or whatever. That's not what we're talking about. We are talking about means of production, either, means to exploit others, etc. So thank you very much. That's a really good discussion so far. We've got now a sort of a last round to sum up, and Ian's got his hand up, so I'm going to take him first.
I just wanted to respond to the managerial class. It's just worth remembering that a notion of the managerial class is itself a Weberian and not a Marxist concept. If you cast your mind back to the Registrar General's classification of about 30 years ago, it tended to be 1, 2, and 3 were non-manual, and managers came in the kind of 2 or maybe 3A, non-manual, but depends what we're talking about, isn't it? If anybody wants a job, there's one going in Durham at the moment for a store manager for the Yorkshire Trading Company. It's quite a big shop. Guess what? 28,000 a year. That'll just send you off to the stockbrokers to polish up your portfolio. And I mean, I was a deputy manager of a care home, and care homes where I've worked as a nurse over the years. No one's under any illusions about what the job of being a manager of a care home is like. Yeah, for to say that that's part of a managerial class is like saying the foreman is a part of the bourgeoisie. As I say, managerial class is a Weberian construct rather than a Marxist one. And the other thing is, of course, what we also haven't really kind of touched on that much is the idea of the class as in the act of coming into being. In a sense, the proletariat is at the moment a nascent class. It's a class which has yet to realize itself in its historic destiny to become a class, and that's what we're concerned with. That's what we're concerned with in terms of class consciousness and class struggle. Yes, workers learn in class struggle, but to do it in isolation from a theoretical perspective which can make sense of the world. is a hiding to nothing, and that's why I believe we have to organise as Marxists rather than as Labour Party 2.0 or whatever.
Thank you, Ian. I think that's where that circle of awareness is actually quite good, because it talks about on the inside you have, the communists who have that theoretical understanding of Marxism, etc., and they have to bring it outwards. Without it, people will struggle always, will go on strikes, etc. But we also have to bring them the good news of actually what kind of society we could be fighting for. That doesn't happen automatically, working out that communism is a good idea. You don't work that out automatically, sadly. Most people don't. Luke, do you want to come back in now to sum up?
Sure, I'll do so by touching on 2 points. One, this idea of the circle of awareness kind of as an organizing tool. Well, on the one hand, I find myself wanting to defer to folks who have more experience in on-the-ground organizing. But my other thought, though, is that perhaps it would instruct us in some way or give us reason to think about the importance of seeking unity with other Marxists in a way. And perhaps the idea of building an organization not so much about going to the masses on the street, so to speak, to use a far too vague term, but to look to the folks who are closest around us and try to bring kind of programmatic unity amongst those who are closest to those ideas already. The other thing I want to touch on is actually a question John brought up in the chat, which I think, he kind of addressed also speaking, but it got me thinking about an interesting point. He asks, is it possible in modern society to develop the class for its self-consciousness, abolition of the wage? And, it got me thinking, we've talked a lot about the class, but the question of demands, I think we ask ourselves, are class demands, immediate workplace demands, so to speak, are those the most widely applicable to appealing to society? And I think there's a convincing reason why one would respond no, that they're not. And it's interesting to think about that, because on the one hand, Lenin makes that exact point in What Is to Be Done, is that it's not the economic demands, it's the police abuses, it's the various political affronts that actually bring the most people together. That's why he was so pissed off, for example, that the Dreyfus affair, wasn't taken more account of by the French socialists. They really missed that opportunity. Here in the US, a very influential academic, this guy Vivek Chibber, recently wrote a piece called Class Matrix, where he basically said, we need to get away from all the stuff in regards to culture that kind of obscures the more fundamental and more graspable capitalist, worker relation. And I think that there's a good reason to actually say that's kind of missing the point in a way. William Clare Roberts, a guy who wrote a well-known book called Marx's Inferno, he and another person speak about the idea of freedom being the idea that actually has the appeal to a large amount of people. And then I'll just end by saying, I think then that's another reason why the demand for a democratic republic can be something that brings in a lot of people. Thanks.
Thank you, Luke. Matthew, do you want to sum up?
Yeah, and I think the first thing is that, I agree with Ian's important point, which I've said previously, that of course that the working class is not fully a class until it actually overthrows capitalism and takes power and abolishes all class society, which is exactly its role in history. And until it does that, actually it's not. It is a nascent class. I think there's also interesting point in terms of what Brian's put in the chat in terms of union organization. And I think that, this really good point that Marx makes, in the 1840s in Poverty of Philosophy, where he says, well, the working class can form itself as a class against the capitalists, exactly sort of trade union consciousness, but then it's to go beyond that, and that precisely you can see that, clearly in terms of the inadequacy of, the sort of assault that's been visited on the unions. That actually it shows exactly the deficiency of that consciousness and of those politics. Most clearly, obviously, in the miners' strike itself in '84, which was the greatest sort of battle, in post-war period, because of precisely exactly, as was summed up in about month 10 by one of the guys we've been working with. He said, well, this isn't actually about the right to work down holes in the ground. He says, it's about power. Well, who's got power? Precisely, it takes you 10 months of being battered over the head by cops to understand that. And this exactly is the whole thing in terms of, union organization. The problem with union organization is that the unions have failed to deliver. The reason why people have not maintained union membership, and unions have got problems, in those terms, is the failure to deliver, because precisely it's inadequate against the attacks of the capitalists. And the question is, okay, how do we get to the point where we have a politics, a politics of organization which is sufficient to actually withstand, to actually take on the ruling class? Because the basic sort of reformist notion that you negotiate, and all this sort of stuff, and all this, essentially under conditions in which there's, the ruling class is quite, desperate to try and squash the workers and so on and so forth. That's not just, it doesn't cut it. People can see that, so it's about a different kind of trade unionism and a development of politics.
Absolutely, well put, Matthew. I think for communists, for us, the task also is not just to democratize organizations like the Labour Party, but very much the trade union movement as well. I mean, the leaders of the trade unions have actually no interest in overthrowing capitalism, do they? They exist firmly within capitalism. That's the base of their whole existence. If they overthrow capitalism, they'd be out of a job or out of their, point of existence. Some of them, of course, will be, like we discussed, it's a question of class consciousness as well. Ian Hodson, Matt Rack, etc. These are communist, working class, trade union leaders. But in general, I think there is a disconnect between the trade unionists, the workers below struggling against capitalism, and those below who don't actually want to get rid of capitalism. We need to break them from that. That was a really interesting discussion today. Really enjoyed it. Thank you very much. I think we positively answered the question, is there still a working class? Yes, it's actually bigger than it used to be at Marx's and Engels's times. It's perhaps not politically more advanced at the moment, but that is our job. And, I do quite like that circle of awareness and the role that we in the middle have to play in bringing the good news out to those on strike and to those struggling against capitalism, and bringing class conscious as well, and an understanding of where we could go as a class. If we understand where we're going, our power would be unimaginable. I mean, we could do all sorts of things unite in a united way. One of the things we're going to look closer to next week is the question of why is it not happening, and is there something about human nature that stops us going to socialism, fighting for socialism? You will have heard that many times. Anybody on the left who's a socialist, communist, you will hear plenty of times. It's a nice idea, but people are just not made for it. We're greedy, we want to have more, etc., etc. So next week, we're looking at various aspects to do with that, the question of alienation, the question of the role of ideology, and of course, how we can struggle to overcome it, and what Marx and Engels were saying about this. Thank you very much, comrades, for joining us all tonight. See you next week, hopefully. Bye-bye.